England in the middle of the 15th century was a land torn apart. The Wars of the Roses had begun to stain the kingdom with blood, splitting noble houses into bitter factions. On one side stood the House of York, bearing the white rose as its emblem. On the other stood the House of Lancaster, sworn to defend the red rose. Every manor, every market, and even the king's court was shaken by this struggle for the throne. It was in this troubled time, in the year 1443, that a fragile child came into the world. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. She was born at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, the only daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his wife, Margaret Beauchamp. Her father was a man of ambition and lineage, descended from John of Gaunt, son of the mighty Edward III. Through him, the blood of kings flowed in her veins. But along with that royal blood came danger, for noble birth was as much a curse as it was a blessing in a kingdom riven by civil war. Margaret's early years were marked by uncertainty. Her father died when she was still a toddler, leaving her the sole heir to the Beaufort fortune. Instead of a carefree childhood, she inherited titles, estates, and a place in the dangerous web of English politics. She was only a little girl, but her name already carried weight. Ambitious men began to whisper of her value, not for her own sake, but for the alliances her hand in marriage could create. In the cold stone halls of Bletsoe, she grew up under the watchful eyes of her mother. Her days were filled with lessons suited for a noble child. She learned to read prayers in Latin, to recite the lives of saints, and to stitch fine embroidery. She learned obedience, silence, and the duties expected of women of her station. Yet she also learned to watch and to listen. Her dark eyes followed the movements of the household knights, the stern clerks, and the noble guests who came to bargain and scheme. Even as a child, she absorbed the sense that her life was not her own. The shadow of Lancaster pressed heavily upon her. The Beauforts were loyal to that house, though their legitimacy was often questioned. This loyalty, combined with Margaret's inheritance, made her a valuable prize. While she played with her maids or walked the castle gardens, powerful lords debated who would claim her hand. Marriage was not a choice for her, it was a weapon, a strategy, a move on the chessboard of power. By the age of 9, she was already betrothed. A child, barely able to write her own name in steady letters, was promised as a bride. The union was meant to strengthen the bonds between families, to secure land and loyalty. For Margaret, it meant the end of her innocence. Her prayers at night became less about childish wishes and more about courage, for even then she understood that her future held burdens far beyond her years. Her piety grew with her fear. The chapel of Bletsoe became her refuge. There, beneath the flickering light of candles, she knelt on cold stone and whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary. She asked for protection, for guidance, for strength. Faith became the anchor of her soul. It was not mere devotion, but survival. In a world where men wielded swords and decided fates, Margaret clung to God as her only certainty. Outside her walls, the kingdom burned. Lords raised banners and armies marched. Battles raged at St. Albans and Towton, filling fields with the dead. The white rose and the red rose clashed again and again, each claiming divine right. And through it all, the young girl with solemn eyes was carried forward, step by step, toward a destiny she could not escape. When she turned 12, the matter of her marriage was settled in earnest. The king himself, Henry VI, intervened. He arranged her union with Edmund Tudor, his half-brother. Edmund was a man in his mid-20s, far older than the fragile child who was to become his wife. To him, Margaret was not a girl but a vessel for the future, a path by which the blood of Lancaster might be secured. The decision was final. Margaret had no voice. At 12 years old, she was taken from her mother's household and delivered into the keeping of her new husband. Thus ended her childhood. The halls of Bletsoe, with their carved beams and quiet chapels, were left behind. She entered instead the fortress of manhood and power, where she would soon learn the true weight of her role. Her life was no longer her own, and the kingdom looked upon her not as a child, but as the mother of kings yet unborn. Margaret Beaufort was not yet 13 when she was led to the altar. Her small frame was hidden beneath layers of heavy cloth, her hair braided and bound as befitted a noble bride. The marriage to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, was more ceremony than celebration. For Margaret, it was not love, nor choice, but duty. She bowed her head, whispered her vows, and in that moment, her childhood ended forever. Edmund Tudor was a man of ambition. Born of Queen Catherine of Valois and her Welsh servant Owen Tudor, he was half-brother to King Henry VI. He had risen by the king's favour and by the strength of Lancaster loyalty. To him, marriage to Margaret was not merely a union but a political triumph. Through her, he gained access to the Beaufort fortune and the royal blood that flowed in her veins. Margaret became the keystone of his hopes, the means by which he might secure power for his line. The young bride was sent to Wales, far from the familiar chapels and gardens of Bletsoe. The rugged hills of Pembrokeshire, with their grey skies and windswept coasts, became her new world. In the cold stone halls of Pembroke Castle, Margaret lived as a wife, though she was still a child in body and spirit. The rough voices of soldiers echoed through the courtyards. The chill of the sea air seeped through the windows. Her husband's demands were sharp and relentless. Margaret endured them in silence, her prayers now rising daily, desperate and unceasing. In the late months of her 13th year, Margaret learned she was with child. The news carried both hope and dread. For Edmund, it meant the promise of an heir, the strengthening of his claim. For Margaret, it meant danger. Her body was small, too frail for the weight of motherhood, and whispers in the castle warned that many a young bride had not survived her first labour. Yet there was no escape. The future of Lancaster rested in her womb. But fate was cruel. As the year 1456 wore on, England's turmoil deepened. The Wars of the Roses swept across the land, and Pembroke was not spared from the tides of violence. In November of that year, Edmund Tudor was taken prisoner by Yorkist forces. He was thrown into Carmarthen Castle, where disease and poor conditions claimed him before winter was through. He died of plague, leaving Margaret widowed at only 13. Alone, heavy with child, she faced the world with no protector. The halls of Pembroke fell silent around her. Margaret's maids whispered prayers as they tended her. Every sound of clashing swords beyond the walls reminded her that armies still roamed the countryside. She clung to her faith, pressing a rosary between her fingers until the beads cut into her skin. In those nights of fear, she prayed not only for her soul but for the child she carried, the last legacy of her lost husband. In January of 1457, after weeks of pain and exhaustion, Margaret was brought to the birthing chamber. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and herbs, the midwives moving in hushed tones. For hours she struggled, her young body strained to breaking. It was said later that she nearly died upon the bed, her life hanging by a thread. But she endured, and with her endurance came a cry, thin, but full of life. Her son was born. The child was named Henry Tudor. Small and fragile like his mother, he was wrapped in linen and placed in her arms. Though her face was pale and her strength nearly gone, Margaret gazed upon him with fierce devotion. Here was her purpose, her reason for survival. She was only 13, but she was now a mother, and her child would one day carry the weight of dynasties. Her recovery was slow and painful. The ordeal left her body weakened forever. She would never bear another child, though she lived many years and married more than once. The birth of Henry Tudor marked both triumph and tragedy, the continuation of Lancaster blood and the breaking of her youthful strength. Margaret herself often spoke of this time with reverence, saying that she had been preserved by God for a higher purpose. As she lay in her chamber, the kingdom outside still trembled with war. York and Lancaster clashed, and kings rose and fell. But within Pembroke Castle, a small boy slept beside his young mother, unaware that his life would alter the course of England. Margaret, frail yet unyielding, looked upon him and vowed in silence that she would see him rise. For her, suffering was not the end, it was the beginning. Margaret Beaufort was barely more than a child, yet she now carried the responsibilities of widowhood and motherhood. At 13, she had already endured more than most women faced in a lifetime. The birth of her son had left her body weakened, her health fragile, but her spirit did not falter. She had one purpose, to protect Henry Tudor. The years after Edmund Tudor's death were years of constant danger. The Wars of the Roses raged across England, and the fortunes of Lancaster and York rose and fell like tides. Pembroke Castle, where Henry first lay in his cradle, stood as a vulnerable outpost in turbulent Wales. The child was heir to the Lancastrian cause, and that alone made him a target. Margaret knew that powerful men would seek to use him or to destroy him. At first, the infant Henry remained under the guardianship of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother. Jasper was devoted to the boy, treating him almost as a son of his own. He sheltered both Margaret and Henry in the castles of Wales, offering what protection he could as battles swept through the countryside. But even Jasper's loyalty could not shield them from the shifting fortunes of war. In 1461, the Yorkist cause triumphed at Towton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. Edward of York seized the throne, becoming King Edward IV. For the Lancastrians, it was a disaster. Henry VI was driven into hiding, and the Red Rose seemed withered and broken. Jasper Tudor fled, and young Henry was left behind. The boy, barely 4 years old, was placed under the custody of Yorkist lords. Pembroke Castle itself fell into the hands of William Herbert, a loyal servant of Edward IV. For Margaret, it was a cruel blow. Her son was no longer in her care, nor even in the care of her trusted kin. He was now a hostage to fortune, raised in the household of a man loyal to her enemies. Margaret's heart ached as she rode away from Pembroke, leaving her child behind. She had no power to resist, no army to fight for her, only her prayers and her will. But within her, a fire began to burn, a resolve that one day, she would see her son restored to his rightful place. Widowhood for a noblewoman was never a private matter. Margaret was still a valuable heiress, and her hand in marriage was once again a prize for ambitious men. She was married a second time, to Sir Henry Stafford, a member of the powerful Stafford family. This union brought her some measure of peace. Stafford was older, gentler, less demanding than Edmund had been. Though it was not a marriage of love, it allowed Margaret a few quiet years, a chance to recover strength and to navigate the stormy seas of politics with caution. During this time, Margaret's devotion deepened. She fasted often, prayed daily, and surrounded herself with the rituals of the Church. Her faith was her armor, her shield against despair. Yet beneath her calm exterior, she never forgot her son. Each letter she sent, each whispered word to her allies, carried the same purpose, to secure Henry's safety and future. But even peace did not last. The wars flared again, shifting like a restless storm. King Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne, only to be toppled once more. The battles at Barnet and Tewkesbury crushed the Lancastrian cause. The young Prince Edward, son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, was slain. Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London. With their deaths, the direct Lancastrian line was extinguished. And yet, one hope remained. A small boy with solemn eyes, growing quietly in the household of William Herbert. Henry Tudor, Margaret's son. Through him, the blood of Lancaster still flowed. Though few recognized it at the time, Margaret understood. The fate of her family, and perhaps of the kingdom, rested on his fragile shoulders. When she prayed in her private chapel, she often spoke of this destiny. She believed her survival in childbirth, her strength in widowhood, and her endurance in suffering were all signs of divine purpose. God had preserved her, she said, so that her son might one day rule. It was a belief that carried her through years of exile, of suspicion, of political danger. As the wars continued to rage, Margaret moved carefully, a widow navigating among wolves. She could not wield the sword, but she wielded faith, intelligence, and unyielding resolve. Her body remained frail, but her will was iron. She was the mother of Henry Tudor, and she would do whatever it took to keep him alive. By the mid-1470s, England was firmly in the hands of the Yorkists. Edward IV ruled with strength, and the Red Rose of Lancaster seemed to have withered into memory. The Lancastrian princes were gone, their cause destroyed at Tewkesbury, their blood spilled on the battlefield or in the Tower. Yet one boy still lived, Henry Tudor, the quiet ward of the Herbert family in Wales. And behind him, like a shadow and a flame, stood his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret was still young, not yet 30, but her life had been shaped by loss and endurance. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, died in 1471 after injuries suffered in the wars. Once again, Margaret was a widow, left to navigate the treacherous tides of power alone. She remarried soon after, this time to Thomas Stanley, a man of cunning and influence, whose loyalty shifted with the winds of fortune. The marriage was practical, not born of affection. For Margaret, it was a shield, a way to ensure protection, wealth, and access to court. For Stanley, it was an alliance with a woman whose son still carried royal blood. Her son's position, however, was perilous. Though only a boy, Henry represented the last thread of the Lancastrian claim. King Edward IV was no fool. He watched carefully, knowing that even a single surviving rival could one day threaten his house. It was this suspicion that drove Henry across the sea. In 1471, he and his uncle Jasper Tudor fled England, seeking refuge in Brittany. There, among foreign lords and distant courts, Henry grew into manhood, far from the kingdom that was his birthright. For Margaret, the exile was agony. Her son was beyond her reach, separated by the Channel, living under the uncertain mercy of foreign dukes. She could not hold him, could not guide him, could not even protect him with her prayers at his bedside. Yet she never wavered. From her manors in England, she wrote letters, sent messages, and whispered promises to those who still dreamed of Lancaster's return. Every coin she saved, every favor she earned at court, was bent toward one purpose: to keep Henry safe until his time came. The years dragged on, and the political wind shifted once again. King Edward IV held power firmly, but his brother, Richard of Gloucester, cast a long and watchful shadow. Rumors swirled of betrayal and ambition. When Edward suddenly died in 1483, leaving the throne to his young son, the kingdom braced for upheaval. Richard seized the crown, declaring himself Richard III. The princes in the Tower, Edward's sons, vanished into silence and fear. And with their disappearance, a space opened, one that Margaret recognized with fierce clarity. Her son Henry, now grown into a young man of 19, became the last true heir of Lancaster. In him, Margaret saw not only survival but destiny. The wars had consumed thousands, kings had risen and fallen, but through it all, Henry had endured. His exile, his obscurity, had preserved him. Now, with York divided and Richard III despised by many, the time had come to move. Margaret became the silent architect of rebellion. Her letters traveled in secret, carried by trusted hands. She whispered to discontented lords, promising them a future under Henry Tudor. She offered alliances, gold, and, most importantly, the hope of uniting Lancaster and York through marriage. For she had already envisioned it: her son would wed Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. Through their union, Red Rose and White Rose would become one. Civil war would end, and a new dynasty would rise. It was a dangerous game. Richard III was ruthless, and spies filled his court. Margaret lived under constant suspicion, her every move watched. At times she risked imprisonment, even death, for her plots. But she pressed on, guided by faith and by her unyielding love for her son. She believed God had chosen Henry for this purpose, and she would not falter. In Brittany, Henry received word of his mother's plans. He trained, he prepared, though doubt lingered. He was young, untested, with only a handful of loyal supporters. Yet the thought of his mother, steadfast across the sea, gave him strength. Her faith in him became his armor. Her vision became his destiny. And so, the exiled boy who had once been cradled in Pembroke Castle now stood ready to return as a conqueror. Behind him lay years of silence and waiting. Before him lay the throne of England itself. Margaret had endured pain, widowhood, and separation, but at last the moment approached when all her sacrifices would bear fruit. The mother of Henry Tudor would soon see the kingdom tremble again. The year was 1485. For over a decade, Henry Tudor had lived in exile across the sea. He was a man now, no longer the frail child born in Pembroke Castle, but still untested in the ways of war and kingship. His claim to the throne was fragile, built on the broken line of Lancaster and the loyalty of a few scattered allies. Yet behind him stood a force stronger than any sword, his mother, Margaret Beaufort. From her household in England, Margaret had worked tirelessly. She moved quietly in Richard III's court, careful in her words, careful in her gestures. But beneath the mask of obedience, she wove a web of alliances. She wrote to discontented nobles. She bargained with those who longed for stability after years of bloodshed. Most of all, she promised unity. If Henry Tudor triumphed, he would wed Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. Through that marriage, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York would at last be bound together. The plan was bold, perhaps impossible. But Margaret's will was iron. She prayed ceaselessly, fasting for her son's cause. Every candle she lit in the chapel, every whispered prayer at dawn, was offered for Henry's safe return. Even when suspicion grew and Richard threatened to strip her of her lands, she pressed forward, unwavering. Her faith did not falter. God had preserved her in her youth, had spared her life in childbirth. Now she believed he would deliver her son to the throne. In August 1485, Henry landed in Wales with his small force. The news spread across the countryside, carrying both hope and fear. Richard III marched swiftly to meet him, determined to crush the challenge before it grew. The two armies met at Bosworth Field. It was there, in the rolling countryside of Leicestershire, that the fate of England was decided. The battle raged with thunderous violence. Richard, fierce and unrelenting, fought like a man possessed. But the loyalty of men is a fragile thing. Among those who held back from the fight was Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband. For months he had played a dangerous game, feigning loyalty to Richard while secretly drawn to Henry's cause. On that day, his choice proved decisive. As Richard pressed toward Henry in a final desperate charge, Stanley's men turned the tide. The king was surrounded and slain upon the field. The White Boar of York fell, and with it, the last of Richard's cause. When the dust cleared, Henry Tudor stood victorious. A crown, taken from the fallen king, was placed upon his head by Lord Stanley. The soldiers cried out his new title, King Henry VII. The boy once exiled, once raised in another man's household, now ruled England. Far away, in her manor, Margaret Beaufort received the news. Tears filled her eyes as she knelt in prayer. The child she had borne at 13, the son she had nearly died to bring into the world, was now king. Her suffering, her plotting, her unyielding devotion had been rewarded. Through her, the House of Tudor was born. When Henry entered London in triumph, Elizabeth of York by his side, Margaret walked at his side with quiet dignity. She was no longer merely the widow, the heiress, the schemer in shadows. She was My Lady the King's Mother, a title that carried reverence across the realm. Though she had no crown, her influence was unmatched. She was the matriarch of a new dynasty, the woman whose endurance had forged the path for a united kingdom. Yet even in triumph, Margaret remained humble in her way. She dressed in sober gowns, devoted herself to works of piety and charity, and built schools and colleges in service of God. But beneath that cloak of devotion lay steel. She advised her son with sharp wisdom, guiding his rule with prudence and caution. In council, her voice was heard. In matters of family, her word was law. Those who underestimated her learned quickly that the king's mother was no passive figure. For Margaret, Bosworth was not the end but the beginning. Her son's reign was the fruit of her sacrifice, but it also marked her rise to the place she had long envisioned. She had endured tragedy, widowhood, exile, and danger. She had prayed through years of despair. And in the end, she had triumphed, not with a sword, but with faith, cunning, and the fierce devotion of a mother who refused to yield. The crown won at Bosworth was not the end of Margaret Beaufort's story. In truth, it was the fulfillment of her life's purpose, yet it also marked the beginning of her lasting influence. As Henry VII settled into his kingship, Margaret assumed a new and unprecedented role. She was not a queen, yet she carried more authority than many who had worn the crown. She was called simply My Lady the King's Mother, and with that title came power. Margaret lived not as a widow hidden in quiet estates, but as a presence at the very heart of her son's court. She moved with a mixture of humility and command. Her gowns were dark, her veil plain, her demeanor pious. Yet every lord and courtier understood, her word carried weight. She advised Henry on matters of policy and marriage, on alliances and betrayals. Few decisions passed without her knowledge. She, who had endured so much in silence, now spoke with authority. Her dream of unity between Lancaster and York became reality through Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York. The red rose and the white rose merged into the Tudor rose, a symbol of peace after decades of war. Through that union, the wounds of civil conflict slowly began to heal. Children were born, securing the line, Arthur, Margaret, Henry, Mary. From those children would come future kings and queens, stretching across centuries. It was Margaret's legacy, written not only in blood but in the survival of England itself. And yet, for all her influence, Margaret remained deeply devout. She rose before dawn to pray, her knees pressed to the cold stone floors of her chapel. She fasted, she studied scripture, and she poured wealth into the founding of colleges at Cambridge. To her, the education of priests and scholars was as vital as the wielding of crowns. She believed learning would preserve the kingdom as surely as armies. But though she cloaked herself in faith, her mind never ceased to be sharp, calculating, and vigilant. She understood the fragility of dynasties, having seen so many collapse in her youth. She guided her son with careful counsel, urging thrift, order, and caution. It was said Henry trusted her above all others. Even the Queen, Elizabeth of York, deferred at times to Margaret's iron presence. In 1503, sorrow struck again. Her beloved grandson, Prince Arthur, died young, leaving his brother Henry as heir. Margaret's heart ached, yet she knew the dynasty would endure. The second son, bold and restless, would one day become Henry VIII, carrying the Tudor name into a new age. Thus the line she had fought so fiercely to preserve would not end. In her final years, Margaret withdrew more deeply into her piety, yet she remained active in the affairs of court. She lived to see her grandson crowned in 1509, after Henry VII's death. Old now, her body frail, she still carried herself with the dignity of a queen in all but name. At the coronation banquet, she sat in a place of honor, watching the young Henry VIII take his place on the throne. It was the triumph of her life's work, from the girl who had been a bride at 12, to the mother who bore a king at 13, to the matriarch of a dynasty that would shape England for generations. Only 2 months later, Margaret Beaufort passed away. She died in June of 1509, at the age of 66. The bells tolled, and across England, prayers were said for the soul of the king's mother. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, her tomb carved with an image of a woman in prayer, her face serene, her hands folded, her robe simple. It was a fitting monument for one whose life had been a union of faith and power, of humility and ambition. Her story was one of tragedy and triumph, of suffering and endurance. She had been a child forced into marriage, a mother nearly broken by childbirth, a widow cast adrift in war. Yet she had risen above it all. Through faith, intelligence, and unyielding devotion, she had shaped the fate of a kingdom. Without her, there would have been no Tudor dynasty, no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I. The course of English history itself bore her mark. Margaret Beaufort left behind no crown of her own, but something greater, a legacy that outlived her, a dynasty that defined an age. She was the mother of a king, the architect of peace, and the quiet force that turned tragedy into triumph. Her life reminds us that even in the darkest of times, strength can be found in faith, and that the devotion of a single mother can alter the destiny of a nation.